Wallace Cole. The date is February 1st, 1959. The temperature on the eastern slope of Khalat Syakhl is somewhere around -25 degrees Celsius. That's -13 Fahrenheit for those of us who learned cold the American way. The way that means layers and wood smoke and knowing where your feet are at all times. The wind is coming down off the ridge in the way that wind does in high exposed places. Not in gusts, not in waves, but in a steady, indifferent push that doesn't care what's in its way. It moves through clothing like clothing isn't there. It finds the gaps at your wrists and your collar and the small of your back, and it settles in, and it stays. 9 people are making camp on this slope. They are not inexperienced. I want you to understand that before anything else. These are not tourists who wandered off a trail. These are not thrill seekers who underestimated the mountain. These 9 people hold the highest hiking certifications available in the Soviet Union at the time, a certification that requires completing 300 kilometers of difficult terrain. They have done this before. They know what cold is. They know what mountains do to people who don't respect them. They have axes. They have a stove. They have food, warm clothing, sleeping bags, and the particular competence that comes from having put yourself in hard places enough times to know how to come back out. They are setting up their tent on the open slope rather than in the tree line 1.5 kilometers below. That decision will matter. We will come back to it. Their leader's name is Igor Dyatlov, 23 years old, radio engineering student, the kind of young man who organizes expeditions the way other young men organize card games. Because it's what he does, because he's good at it, because the mountains are where he feels most himself. He has done this before. He will not do it again. The others, Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, one of 2 women in the group, 20 years old, studying economics. By all accounts, one of the most spirited members of the party. Zinaida Kolmogorova, Yuri Krivonishenko, who has spent time working at a nuclear facility in the closed city of Kishtim, Alexander Kolevatov, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolay Thibaut Brignol, and the oldest of the group, Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a sports instructor who joined this particular expedition at the last moment, and who, for reasons that will become relevant later, is one of the more curious figures in this story. 9 people, a tent, a slope called Dead Mountain, and a night that no one survived to explain. My name is Wallace Cole. I grew up in the ridge and valley country of southern West Virginia, a part of the world that doesn't appear on many maps worth mentioning. We had a farm, cattle, hay, gardens. No city water when I was a boy. 2 television channels if the weather cooperated. No stoplight in the county. No grocery store. The Appalachian Trail ran along the ridge behind our property, and the people who hiked it were always from somewhere else. I tell you this because it matters to how I read evidence. I know what mountains do. I know what cold does. I know what it means when experienced people in remote terrain make decisions that look irrational from the outside. I grew up in a place where the woods had a specific vocabulary, sounds, signs, silences, and where the people who lived closest to that vocabulary had the most respect for what it sometimes described. There are places in this world where the official explanation is thin, where it fits some of the facts and leaves others sitting in the room, unaddressed, waiting, where the people who conducted the investigation knew it too and said so 30 years later when they had nothing left to lose by saying it. Dyatlov Pass is one of those places. I have spent a long time with this case. I have read everything I can get hold of in the original documentation, the search party accounts, the autopsy reports, the radiation analysis, the investigation files. I have read the testimony of the one man who came home. I have been through the competing theories one by one and run each of them against the fullness of the evidence. What this channel is, what I'm trying to do here, is different from what you'll find in most coverage of this case. I am not going to walk you through every theory and ask you to pick one. I am going to show you what the evidence survives and what it doesn't. I am going to show you what the evidence actually says, eliminate what doesn't hold up. And in episode 3, I am going to tell you what I think happened. Not a guess, not a preference, a conclusion, the one that's left when everything else falls apart. That is the methodology. That is how this channel works. But before the theories and before the conclusion, there is the story itself. This is episode 1. Tonight I'm going to tell you what happened. The Ural Polytechnical Institute in Sverdlovsk had a hiking club. This was not unusual. Soviet universities of the era took outdoor endurance and mountaineering seriously, partly from cultural tradition, and partly because the state apparatus had a particular appreciation for capable young people with high pain thresholds and strong bodies. The club had been sending groups into the northern Urals for years. The northern Urals are not the Alps. They are not dramatic in the postcard sense. They are ancient and cold and quiet in a way that older mountain ranges sometimes are, worn down by time to something that feels less like scenery and more like territory, something with its own opinion about whether you belong there. Igor Dyatlov was 23 and had been on expeditions before. He was the kind of group leader who inspired confidence, organized, technically capable, calm under pressure. He planned this trip to Mount Otorten. The word Otorten, in the language of the Mansi people who have lived in that region for generations, translates to something in the neighborhood of, "Don't go there." I mention that not as atmosphere. I mention it because it is true and because it will become relevant. The route was ambitious, roughly 300 kilometers through the northern Urals in January and February, the dead of winter. The plan was to reach Otorten and return, roughly 3 weeks. A full group assembled, 9 certified mountaineers plus 1 more, a 10th man named Yuri Yudin, who joined the early stages of the trip. On January 23rd, the group departed Sverdlovsk by train. 2 days later, they reached Ividel, the last significant town on that road. From there, they moved north to a small settlement called Vizhai, the last inhabited place to the north, the last point where they would be in contact with anything that could be called civilization. A few days after leaving Vizhai, Yuri Yudin turned back. A flare-up of sciatica, joint pain in his leg, made continuing impractical. He said goodbye to his friends, watched them head north into the cold, and made his way back. Number 2. He is the only one who came home. He died in 2013. He spent the rest of his life trying to understand what happened to the people he left behind on that mountain. He never stopped. He never got an answer. On January 31st, the group reached the base of the highland area. They set up a storage depot, in Russian, a labaz, in a wooded valley, caching surplus food and equipment for retrieval on the return trip. This matters. It is the act of people who are organized and experienced and fully planning to come back. They left the heavy gear for later. They would not need it later. February 1st. The group begins moving through the pass toward Mount Otorten. Weather deteriorates. A snowstorm moves in, dropping visibility. In the reduced visibility, the group drifts west instead of north. When the clouds clear enough to take a reading, they realize their error. They are on the eastern slope of Kolath Shakul, which translates from the Mansi language as Dead Mountain. More precisely, as I understand the translation, a place where game does not go, a place that animals avoid. When Dyatlov recognizes the error, he makes a decision. They are already at elevation. Descending 1.5 kilometers to the tree line would mean losing altitude they have worked to gain, and it is late in the day. He makes camp on the open slope. I want to sit with this for a moment. I grew up in mountains, not the Urals, the southern Appalachians, which are older and gentler, but still real mountains with real weather and real terrain. The first thing you learn, the thing everyone who has spent serious time in backcountry knows in their bones, is that you shelter in trees when you can. Trees break wind. Trees give you fuel and cover and something to orient to. An exposed slope in deteriorating weather is where you go when you have to, not when you have a choice. Dyatlov had a choice. He was 1.5 kilometers from trees. His group had the equipment and the capability to make that descent. He did not descend. The speculation about why has filled books. His friend Yudin suggested later that Dyatlov may have wanted to practice open-slope camping, a skill the group would need on future expeditions. There is a note in the group's diary that mentions not wanting to lose the altitude. Neither explanation is fully satisfying. The decision is the first anomaly in this case. It will not be the last. By roughly 5 in the afternoon on February 1st, the group had made camp. They cut into the slope to level a platform for the tent, standard practice on angled terrain. The last photographs were taken. The last diary entries were written. The entries are, by all accounts, unremarkable. Some complaints about the weather, some jokes. The mood was ordinary. The mood was fine. The group ate dinner. After that, nothing. That is the gap. Everything that happened on that slope between the last diary entry and the morning of February 26th exists only in physical evidence and the marks left on bodies. No one survived to explain a single moment of it. On February 12th, Dyatlov was supposed to send a telegram from Vizai confirming the group's safe return. No telegram arrived. This was not immediately alarming. Delays happen in the backcountry, and the official sports club was not quick to sound the alarm. It took until February 20th, when the families pushed, for a formal search operation to be organized. On February 26th, a search party located the campsite on Kholat Syakhl. A student named Mikhail Shiravin spotted the tent from the air. When they reached it on foot, here is what they found. The tent was half collapsed, partially buried in snow, cut open from the inside, not torn, not unzipped, cut. Multiple cuts. Not one emergency exit, but several. The cuts were made from inside, pushing outward. The group had needed to leave faster than the door allowed. Everything was inside the tent. Every piece of warm clothing, every boot, every food supply, every sleeping bag, every piece of equipment that a person needs to survive at -13 Fahrenheit on an exposed mountain slope at night. Left behind. The footprints led away from the tent, downhill toward the tree line. 8 or 9 sets. Some bare feet, some socks, some one boot. They were visible for approximately 500 meters before the snow conditions made them unreadable. No other footprints in the area. Not a single print that did not belong to the Dyatlov group. Whatever had caused 9 experienced mountaineers to cut their way out of their tent and flee into the dark, barefoot, in extreme cold, leaving everything they needed to stay alive, it had not left tracks. The first 2 bodies were found that same day, February 26th and 27th. Yuri Dodoshenko and Yuri Krivonishenko. They were at the edge of the tree line, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent, the distance Dyatlov had chosen not to descend earlier. They were under a large Siberian cedar tree, near the remains of a small fire. Both were dressed in underwear and socks. Both had burns on their hands and lower legs, the kind of burns you get when you're too close to a fire and either don't feel the heat or don't have the capacity to move away from it. Both died of hypothermia. High up in the cedar, 5 meters near the top, branches had been broken off. Someone had climbed the tree. The broken branches were on the side facing the tent. Someone had climbed that cedar in the dark and the cold, in underwear, to see something, or to look for something, or to watch for something coming. Over the next weeks, 3 more bodies were found between the cedar and the tent. Igor Dyatlov was 300 meters from the cedar, facing back toward where the tent was. Zinaida Kolmogorova was 480 meters from the cedar, same orientation. Rustem Slobodin was between them. All three were trying to get back to the tent. Not running. They had not been running. The positions of the bodies suggest they had been moving slowly against the wind, losing ground to the cold. Dyatlov had made it farthest back toward the tent. Kolmogorova had nearly reached him. They were trying. They ran out of body heat before they got there. Slobodin had a fracture of the frontal bone of the skull. The autopsy noted it as significant but not the cause of death. He died of hypothermia with a cracked skull. These five, call them the first group, tell a story of people who fled their tent and tried, eventually, to return to it. They made fire. They stayed together at first. Something happened that separated them. The ones who tried to go back didn't make it. That left four unaccounted for. Their bodies were not found until May, almost 4 months later, buried under 4 meters of snow in a ravine 75 meters deeper into the woods from the cedar tree. Lyudmila Dubinina, Semyon Zolotaryov, Alexander Kolevatov, Nikolai Thibault-Brignol. These four had been better dressed than the others when they died. They had taken clothing from those already dead. Dubinina was wearing Krivonishenko's trousers, the ones that had been burned near the fire. Her left foot and shin were wrapped in a torn jacket fragment. They had been organized enough, after whatever happened at the tent, to strip clothing from the dead and distribute it among the living. They had been functional enough to do that. Then they died anyway. And when the medical examiner looked at the bodies of these four, this is where the case stops being a tragedy and becomes something else entirely. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a massive skull fracture. The forensic examiner, a man named Vozrojdeny, noted that the fracture was so severe it could not have been caused by a fall. Semyon Zolotaryov had multiple fractured ribs on his right side. No external wounds. The ribs were broken from a force applied inward. Nothing on the surface of his body showed where that force came from. Lyudmila Dubinina had bilateral rib fractures. Both sides. The medical language here matters. Bilateral rib fractures without external bruising. Vozrojdeny's assessment, on the record, was that the force required to produce that injury pattern was comparable to the force of a high-speed automobile accident. She was also missing her tongue, her eyes, part of her lips and facial tissue. The official explanation offered at the time was post-mortem decomposition, that she had been in a stream and the soft tissue had deteriorated. This explanation has been disputed. The degree of tissue loss, the selectivity of it, the specific areas affected. Forensic analysts have questioned whether decomposition, even in water, fully accounts for what was found. I am going to read to you what Vozrojdeny stated on the record about the injuries to the three most severely damaged bodies. He said that the crushing force could not have been caused by another human being. The force of the blows was too strong, and there was no external soft tissue damage. Not a human being. Not a fall. Falls produce external bruising. A compressive force of extraordinary magnitude, applied without leaving a mark on the surface of the body. I will tell you plainly, I have spent a long time in the woods. I have had experiences in the mountains that I do not have a conventional framework for. And I will get into some of that in later episodes because it is directly relevant to what the evidence in this case is pointing toward. But when I read Vozrojdeny's assessment, I did not read it as a bureaucratic footnote. I read it as a man who had looked at what was in front of him and written down the only honest conclusion he could reach. Not a human being. There is one more layer to this, and I want to handle it carefully because it is the kind of evidence that invites the wrong kind of thinking. When the lead investigator, a man named Lev Ivanov, ordered radiation testing on the last 4 bodies found, only the last 4, not the first 5, the question of why he ordered it at all has never been answered. The results came back showing beta particle contamination on specific items of clothing. Not all clothing, not equipment. Specific garments belonging only to the 4 ravine victims. The contamination was surface level. It washed off partially when the clothing was laundered in running water for 3 hours, indicating the particles had adhered to the outer surface of the fabric rather than penetrating it. The chief radiologist's conclusion was direct. Something had pressed radioactive particles onto the surface of those garments from outside. Not internal contamination. Contact contamination. Something had touched those clothes. The conventional explanation points to Krivonischenko, who had worked at the Mayak nuclear complex, site of a 1957 nuclear waste explosion, and suggests his personal clothing may have been contaminated and transferred particles to others in the group. This accounts for some of the readings. It does not account for the pattern. Workplace contamination distributes broadly. What was found was selective, specific garments, specific areas, in a pattern more consistent with contact with a particular source at a particular time. I am not going to tell you what that source was. Not tonight. That is work for episode 2 and episode 3. I am telling you it is there, that it is documented in primary source evidence, and that every explanation offered for it, offered so far, I should say, has problems. The investigation was opened on February 26, 1959. It was closed on May 28, 1959, a few weeks after the last 4 bodies were recovered. The official conclusion was this: the group died as a result of an unknown, compelling force. The files were classified and sent to a closed archive. Think about that for a second. The lead investigator, Lev Ivanov, gave an interview 30 years later, in 1990, when he was an old man and the Soviet Union was dissolving around him, and it no longer mattered what he said. He said this, that he had suspected at the time, and was almost certain now, that luminous spheres in the sky over the northern Urals had a direct connection to the group's deaths. The man who closed the case and classified it said that. 30 years later, with nothing to gain. There is one more thing I want to leave you with tonight, and it is not from the investigation files. It is from the group themselves. The Dyatlov group produced a handwritten newspaper during the expedition, a trail journal of sorts, meant as entertainment for themselves. They called it the Evening Otor 10. It was written for fun in the style of a newspaper, with mock headlines and inside humor for the group. The final headline they wrote, before their last night alive, reads as follows. From now on, we know that the snowmen exist. They can be met in the northern Urals, next to Otorten Mountain. This has been interpreted, by most researchers, as a joke, an inside reference to something they had heard or read about, a playful nod to folklore. But this was not an obscure reference. In 1958, in fact the year before this expedition, the Soviet Academy of Sciences took the question seriously enough to form a commission and send an expedition into the mountains to investigate reports of what they called the snowman. At that time, this wasn't folklore, it was a scientific question. Our hikers were university students. They knew exactly what that phrase meant, and so did everyone who would read it. I have read it many times. Most people call it a joke. I understand why. I am not certain they are right. I think it was 9 people, highly educated, highly trained, deeply practical, the kind of people who do not write things down casually, recording something in the only way they had available to them. I think it was the language of people who had encountered something they did not have a word for, and who reached for the nearest approximation, and who put it in the newspaper because the newspaper was the place where you wrote down what was true. The last thing they wrote about was the snowmen. The next night, they cut their way out of their tent and ran into the dark. They did not take their boots. They did not take their coats. They evidently did not have time for boots and coats. In episode 2, I will lay out explanations that have been offered for what happened on that slope. I will work through the Soviet official conclusion, the avalanche theory, the military weapons testing theory, the infrasound theory, and others. I will test each one against the weight of the evidence, and I will show you one by one which ones fall apart when confronted with what the evidence actually says. In episode 3, I will tell you what I think happened. Not a theory, a conclusion. The one that's left when everything else falls apart. I'm reminded of the quote by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. I'll be waiting. If you want to be there for that, be sure to follow this channel. Episode 2 is coming.